So today we're here with Becca Tarnas. You guys may remember her from when she joined at the Marian Woodman workshop, Dancing in the Flames. We talked a little bit about active imagination and the imaginal, and we'll be going into that a little bit deeper today with her new release. So Becca is a scholar and an artist and a counseling astrologer. She's an editor of Archi, the Journal of Archetypal Astrology. She has a PhD in philosophy and religion at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, and her dissertation was titled "The Back of Beyond: The Red Books of C.G. Jung and J.R.R. Tolkien." She's now teaching at Pacifica and at CIIS, as well as several other online platforms. So we're going to be talking a little bit today about her recent release. It's called Journey to the Imaginal. It's a reader's guide to J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. So I'm especially stoked to chat today with you about this topic.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to our conversation as well.
Yeah, so today I think we'll chat a little bit more about active imagination, like I was saying before, and as well as the imaginal. And, for listeners who are new to Jung's work, we'll kind of go over what that is and how that comes up in Jung's Red Book and how it comes up for Tolkien and his process as a, visionary genius, I think. But I was always a huge fan of Tolkien and, his books when I was younger. Actually, his books were the first books I feverishly collected. I have a weird thing with collecting books with Jung, but it really started in this kind of fantasy world with his, fairy stories and some of it more like side books, less than the Lord of the Rings itself, but I definitely loved it. But it's been a while since I've been back to the Shire. So I'm interested in how you got called back to Middle Earth.
Well, the first time I was called to Middle Earth, I was 9 years old, and my grade school teacher read The Hobbit out loud to our class. And I was captivated by the story in a way that felt more deep and familiar even than I think any story I'd ever heard up until that point. And there was something about hearing the story out loud too that was really captivating. The sound of the names drew me in. Rivendell, Dale, the Shire. That these names had this kind of echo in my memory, and I was just absolutely enraptured by this story. And so it was several years later before I read The Lord of the Rings, and felt as though I had stumbled across my myth, that there was this feeling of, oh, I belong in this world. And as a teenager, I was 13 years old when I read The Lord of the Rings, and I read it over and over again. I became one of those people who read it each year and had this kind of strange overlay as a teenager where I was living my normal life as an adolescent in high school, the dynamics of social issues, and yet at the same time there was this overlay of an imaginal realm of Middle Earth upon my experience, and that it felt as though I was seeing the world through these two lenses. And I felt it most strongly when I was out in nature. And I would look at sunlight glinting on the trees and feel, well, now I'm in Middle Earth. Now I am in this magical realm. And so that was really what drew me in. And it was a long journey in terms of coming back to that place in adulthood, but that was the original entrance for me as a teenager.
Wow. So, your kind of immersion into this other world, or this pull into into Middle Earth, but this other world that Tolkien created is really fascinating to hear. And to hear, I think about other people, I think about myself who had other worlds that they would go into and identify as, very real spaces for the imaginal to kind of do its work. I'm interested in when you kind of got into Jung and then how you kind of realized that Tolkien had been this key for you.
Jung came later for me, and I had known of Jung kind of just as a household name. My father's work was very much connected with Jungian psychology, and so I knew of Jung, but I didn't know much about Jung until 2009 when the Red Book came out. And I think I saw a New York Times article about it actually. And it even that article and the image of the Red Book, I was immediately drawn in. I had no idea why. I didn't even really register how much I was drawn in. And I wrote my brother at the time. I said, "We should get this. We should get this for our dad. He would like it." But I think something deeper was going on in me, and that there was this immediate connection to Jung's Red Book. So it was a number of years after its publication that I sat down actually to read the Red Book. And my inspiration for reading the Red Book was this parallel between the name of the Red Book and within Tolkien's world, the story of The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, even the Silmarillion, they're all written down in this large manuscript that is bound with two covers of red leather that's called the Red Book of Westmarch. And because I already had that in the back of my mind, that the Red Book of Westmarch was part of Middle Earth and part of Tolkien's world, when I saw Jung's Red Book, then something clicked, and I just had this intuition. What if there's something similar there? So I I read some other works of Jung's that are better known that have been out in the world before that. At the time that I was in graduate school at the California Institute of Integral Studies, but it really was Liber Novus, the Red Book itself, that was my initiation into Jung. And I think that in some ways speaks to the backwards nature in which I sometimes approach certain topics. For example, right at the beginning of my graduate studies, one of the very first books I read was James Hillman's Revisioning Psychology. And I didn't know what was being revisioned until later. I read the revisioning and then read Jung. And so in that same backwards way, I came to Jung's Red Book before most of the other texts that Jung has had published for many decades. And then to my amazement, as I did read the Red Book, I found countless parallels to Tolkien, to his Red Book. And while there had been this intuition that the parallels might be there beyond the name, it was an insane project too. There was no reason to think that there really would be parallels there, and yet it was such a profound revelation to come across really hundreds actually of parallels in terms of images and figures and scenes and so forth. Timing was a major parallel between the two of them. So it ended up being quite a fruitful project, and that's what I ended up writing my PhD on.
That's fascinating to hear. I think to hear also that you've read and reread The Lord of the Rings to the point that you really had it down. I mean, even the language that is so thick, and Tolkien being a philologist and kind of really integrating that into his work. But having these full fleshed out characters, um, and feeling like I feel like I probably had like a similar sensation when holding the Red Book. There's something enchanting. It's that similar feeling of enchantment. When making contact with both of them, but to hear those synchronicities, that were affecting you as really a call to kind of pull out these parallels and to work on this project. That's really interesting. So one of the main overlaps that I got from reading the book was that there's a similarity in their process, and that they used words to describe their process that were a little bit different, but what was central was imagination. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. It's true. What is so central between the two of them is the imagination. And Jung is so much more forthcoming about his process. I mean, when he went through the visionary experiences that became the primary content of the Red Book, he was interested in the vision making capacity, that faculty of imagination. He wanted to understand what it was and where it came from. And so he documented his experiences rigorously. And what a tremendous gift to us. Tolkien is much less forthcoming and also put his energies toward an artistic creation rather than a psychological creation. Now, that's not to say that the Red Book by Jung isn't artistic, nor is it not literary. It is both of those things. But Tolkien veils himself, whereas Jung puts himself at the forefront. And that's a huge difference between these two projects. And Tolkien said that he wouldn't want to be one of the characters in his stories. He saw himself more as witness, but it is that role of witness that we get more hints from his essays, from his letters, and even veiled in some of his more obscure stories. So he has a couple of unfinished stories that he wrote in the 30s and 40s. One's called The Lost Road. Another one is called The Notion Club Papers. They're worth reading, but we're reading them in this kind of half-finished draft form. But baked into those stories are allusions to language, to hearing words, words that he calls ghost words or that are coming through, and various other factors where we just get the sense um, maybe he's referring to himself. But we always have to be really careful when we say something like that. I bring to mind someone like Sonu Shamdasani, the extraordinary editor of the Red Book and now the Black Books, which I see standing prominently and beautifully behind you. Shamdasani coined this term, interprefaction, which is when we create a fact based on our interpretation of certain details around a situation. In this case, he was applying that directly to our lack of information about Jung's Red Book period before the Red Book came out. And so many biographers were doing interprefaction. They were interpreting this period as a psychotic break because they didn't have the necessary information, i.e., the Red Book itself, to fill in that gap. And so I do want to be very careful of not committing this crime of interprefaction with Tolkien. And yet taking what we have that he's put forward, particularly in his essays, where you get a sense for his creative process. My favorite essay that Tolkien wrote is called On Fairy Stories. And it's a beautiful defense of fairy story, the importance of the fairy tale. And he's really, he's defending it. He's bringing it to the fore as something that matters, whereas fairy tales have been so disparaged and relegated to the nursery, as he said. Now, those in the world of Jungian psychology know fairy tales have an extraordinary wisdom to offer us. But in Tolkien's time and Jung's, they were not held in the kind of regard that we, at least in this field, would hold them. Of course, there's many people that still use the term fairy tale or myth to say, well, that's just not true.
Mhm.
Um, so in this essay on fairy stories, the core piece of it is a section called fantasy. And Tolkien lays out his theory of imagination there. He calls it subcreation. And that the subcreation is a process that unfolds in two parts. First, there is the uh, natural arising of images through the imagination, which is then followed by shaping those images through art. And he capitalizes the A of art. And then what is brought forward is the subcreative art. And if this is done successfully, then both the artist or the author, the creator, and the witness or the spectator can enter into that world. And this is an experience of secondary belief, or if it's fully achieved, it's what he calls enchantment. And it's the feeling of being fully within a secondary realm. So we open the pages of The Lord of the Rings, and many people report the experience of feeling as though they have stepped into a world. They can see the trees and hear the wind and feel the the grass under their toes, see the water sparkling in the sunlight. What is that drawing on within us? It immediately draws on our faculty of imagination, and it's communicating something directly from the author's imagination, to our own. And I think that when we read great stories, we often take that capacity for granted, that we are seeing what is laid out on the page. Um, and so this sub-creative art that Tolkien is talking about is really an invitation into imagination, into that imaginal realm. And he would speak about his stories in such a way that you get the sense he really isn't just inventing this. He isn't making it up. He said the stories would arise in his mind as given things. As he would write, they would, he said it would be as though it was writing itself.
Mhm.
Again and again, he would talk about it as a process of discovery. And again, rather than invention, rather than just making it up. But you can see here the difference when we apply his own theory to his process, that he's still shaping it. Like we can go back and read Tolkien's early drafts of The Lord of the Rings, and he edited it and revised it and changed it over time, but there are still core images, core pieces. And many of those core images were there from the earliest of days, the years, 1913, 14, 15, the exact same years that Jung was going through his Red Book period, where Tolkien is writing these core pieces or core words in terms of the invention of his languages. And then everything else gets shaped around that. For example, the spider, the primal spider that, for those who are familiar with The Lord of the Rings, um, we encounter in the form of Shelob, and the two hobbits, Frodo and Sam, meet her in the darkness of her terrifying tunnel on the edge of Mordor.
Mhm.
And that spider, she was there from the earliest note that he took on the voyage of Erendil, he was calling it at that time. And it's just an encounter with the spider, spider with a capital S. And there are so many different pieces, the tree beings, for example, which we later encounter as Ents.
Mhm.
We've got a tree being like that in Jung's Red Book too. And so many things like that, that it was as though the seed was planted in those early years for Tolkien. And he had to just keep writing it until he got the art right, until it was in such a form that when it's handed to us between two covers, we can enter back into that world that he directly experienced.
Yeah, wow. So many different overlaps. And when I was reading, the prologue to this book, talking about imagination and enchantment and this process of subcreation, I was particularly drawn to that idea and the word that he used, or something like that, that denoted his kind of idea of what this kind of mimicking process is, like that it's just we're just refractions of this greater process, that this was a part of a divine imagination for him, and feeling into that almost automatic like compulsion of what's coming through him rather than making it up, which is was so similar to active imagination for Jung. um, can you talk about how those commonalities come through for you?
Mm. Well, first, just for us to give a bit of a definition of what active imagination is, and everyone has their own experiences of it. Active imagination is taking either like an emotion or an image and holding it in your conscious awareness, and actively focusing all of your attention on that. It actually takes quite a bit of effort and energy. It's different than, say, daydream or reverie, or especially different from the dreams of sleep, all of which are very passive. We kind of let go into that stream of images. Active imagination is, it's as though you're trying to catch one of those images and then you stay with it. And this is the extraordinary thing about the psyche, that when we hold an image in our conscious awareness and focus all our attention on it, it cannot stay still. It needs to move. There is animation, movement in the psyche, animation, anima, there's life in the psyche. And so what happens is that image begins to move, it begins to change. And we then have the opportunity to actively engage with it. And in Jung's experience, it was as though he could cross over the threshold and enter into that world, enter into dialogue with these figures. And that's essentially the core of the Red Book. It's all of these different active imagination fantasies that he was going into night after night, starting in the late autumn of 1913. And he would write them down, and that's the core piece of the Red Book. And so active imagination in that sense is really a conscious willing forth of the images. And here is where, when it comes to Tolkien, it's harder to say, was this really active imagination on his part? Was it something more like passive imagination? That there are images or visions arising. I know some pieces of Tolkien's writing comes directly from dream, such as the great wave that became a part of his story of the drowning of Numenor, which is kind of a key trauma in the history of Middle Earth, that took place in the Second Age. That was from a dream that Tolkien was having from childhood onward, a repeating dream that was actually very similar to Jung's flood vision that he received in October of 1913. Both saw this inundating flood or wave coming in over the land, drowning the land. And for Jung, that was he later came to realize, was a kind of precognitive vision of the First World War. Tolkien didn't make that particular connection to it, although he fought in that war, so he was deeply affected by it. The war itself shaped his stories significantly. But that's where we do have to be somewhat careful in terms of what was Tolkien's exact experience. And like Jung, I can imagine that it was made up of multiple threads. Some dream, they both admitted to bringing dreams into their work. Some more in terms of passive fantasy or reverie, something that's kind of naturally arising in a visionary way. And then the active engagement. And we know Jung was doing that. And my sense is that Tolkien's process of writing, actually sitting down to write, that was his form of active imagination, because he would talk about, he'd sit down to write and then the story would tell itself. But it is that kind of active commitment to staying with the image, to staying with the scene, and then trusting that something will naturally arise through that, that you don't have to impose your external sense of, oh, this is what's supposed to happen next. He always talked about, well, this is the natural conclusion based on what has already happened. It just had to unfold that way. And there's this beautiful paragraph that Tolkien wrote, I believe in one of his letters, where he just lays out all of the discoveries that were coming forward through him in his writing process. And he said, he had no idea who Strider was sitting in the corner in Bree any more than Frodo had. He didn't know why Gandalf failed to appear. Indeed, when he first saw one of the Black Riders in the Shire, he thought it was Gandalf in disguise, and then realized as the author, oh no, this is something much more sinister, much darker, much more dangerous or evil. And that was actually the moment early on in writing that he realized, oh, this isn't a children's story. This isn't the new Hobbit like I thought it was going to be.
Hmm.
Um,
Wow.
yeah. So really just kind of coming to him.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about how when I read Lord of the Rings, it's very similar to what people call an open world video game. Like when you get into it, it's very much like you're in the world. And you get that feeling like it could go one of many directions. And it's that um, that sense that I get when you say that he really didn't know any more than Frodo did.
Mhm.
You know, and we think that reminds me of the answer to Job, which is like, talking about God not knowing either.
Absolutely. It's a wonderful description of, I think some people actually make the mistake of thinking the author of a story is like the all-powerful creator God of that story. And rather, I would say the author is the witness, is the historian, is the redactor of this tale, but by no means the omnipotent author, or we should say the omnipotent God. And in that way, just as you're saying, it very much does parallel um, Jung's conception of God in that way of being unconscious of what exactly is unfolding and yet having a very heavy hand in shaping it. I think that's a mistake that, or a sense of hubris that some authors can bring to their work. And that really it's about the creative process is so much about listening rather than trying to control.
Yeah, and I have a great question related to that that I'm going to ask you in a few minutes. But I'm really interested in, you know, the archetypal aspects that you discovered while doing this research. If you want to talk about one that stood out to you the most, or something that was coming through for Tolkien in his work that was kind of a repetitive pattern.
Mm, that's a great question. Definitely one of the ways that Tolkien's work just really stands out is that the archetypal does ring so strongly through it. And um, there's a lot of different ways to talk about archetypes. I personally speak about archetypes more in a Platonic sense, and um, some of my work is as an archetypal astrologer, which brings that archetypal philosophical lens towards the astrological.
Mhm.
Um, in a Jungian sense, archetype is often used to refer to certain figures, and that they take on more of an embodied form rather than these more um, abstract principles. So there's a lot of different ways to talk about archetypes. And in some ways, I think the form of archetype as figure, it's almost like an intermediate form of an archetype. It's not quite as, you could say, pure as just the mandala
Mhm.
or number. Or in astrology, when we refer to like the Saturnian archetype or the Venusian archetype, the presence of beauty, something like that. These figures, they're a little more specific. It's almost like they're a little bit closer to home. And these are the kinds of figures that Jung encountered in his Red Book experiences. And of course, these are the kinds of figures that we see in Tolkien's work as well. And so, one parallel that stood out to me between the two Red Books um, is that for Jung, he encountered this guide who was a magician. And he came to know him by the name of Philemon. And he's this old man, with very alive eyes, long white beard, and white hair, and works in magic. And he, in many ways, guides the hero, guides the figure of Jung in the Red Book through his journey. And in parallel to that, coming out of Tolkien's work, we see Gandalf, who is the first the gray wizard and then later on the white wizard, with his uh, eyes that are alive like coals sparking with fire, and his long beard and hair, and his own dabbling in magic, more than dabbling, embodiment of magic. Very similar figures. And what stands behind them is this archetypal principle that Jung called the wise old man. And we see that archetypal principle in so many different stories, many fairy tales. You can think of Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars, or Merlin in the Arthurian legends. We know this figure, and we probably all have our own kind of connection to that particular figure. And you can look even further back, standing behind that archetypal figure, and see this kind of Senex archetype, which in itself is an expression of the Saturnian principle of old age, time, wisdom, mortality, all of that archetypal presence. So it's like these nested layers coming through into more and more specific form until we arrive at Gandalf and Philemon. And they're each particular expressions, they're unique, and yet the archetypal is alive and well within them. Another such figure that we see in Jung, he speaks about the anima, both as a psychological notion, but also as she comes forward in so many different forms in the Red Book, as Salome, as the young girl in the castle, even as the serpent, most significantly as his soul. And I've put forward some arguments that along the lines of what James Hillman would say, that maybe we shouldn't be calling her his soul, but rather this is just simply soul. This is anima, not his personal anima, but his connection to the anima as a larger archetypal principle. And we encounter her in Tolkien as well. Again, multiple different guises, whether it's the Vala or kind of goddess figure, Elbereth Gilsoniel, or even in a more specific form, Galadriel, who many might be more familiar with. My favorite expression of her in Tolkien's writing is in his short story, Smith of Wootton Major. And it was the last tale that he wrote. It was published in 1967, synchronistically, this just blew me away, in the magazine Red Book. So yet another Red Book that is housing one of these tales. And it's all about this man named Smith who's given a Fey star, a passport into fairy, into the enchanted realm, the imaginal realm. And he goes on journeys back and forth. And on his final visit to that realm, he knows it's his last, he is able to meet the Queen of Fairy. And when you read Tolkien's descriptions of her, I get chills even as I speak about it right now. You have this sense that this Queen of Fairy is a personification of the anima, in the sense, in some ways in the sense that Jung meant it, but maybe even beyond that. It's the anima mundi, the world soul, in this personified form as the Queen of Fairy. And behind all of those various instances expressed both by Tolkien and Jung, we do see this. In this case, it's like the prime archetypal example, the anima mundi herself, who is perhaps what encompasses all of the archetypal principles in her being, that we all participate in her. We are all of her imaginal body. So she's very much the queen of all these tales, the queen of the both Red Books. And we see her standing behind all of the other various expressions.
Mhm. Yeah, but just hearing you talk about that, and in Smith of Wootton Major, which is like one of my favorite ones. I think I have a first
Mm.
edition, that and Farmer Gills of Ham.
Oh, yes.
uh,
Mm.
I just love that one with the, with the dragon too. But I think that when you think of the other world, and like Tolkien talked about, and how it was written in the book that you wrote, that there is a part of that is the imaginal realm. When we talk about it this way, and for many indigenous cultures, that being very much overlapping, it's not up or down, it's right here alongside of us. It's just, shrouded, it's the unseen, the uncanny. So him kind of going into fairy world, and finding the Queen of the Fae. Um, we Celtic folks know what that's all about, but um,
Mhm.
for that to be, it's such an anima figure, because she's there in the unseen. She's queen, but she's only queen there, and I find that to be fascinating for my own personal dissertation.
Mm.
But I wanted to also ask you, in your work, you teach this to students, to the overlap between Jung and Tolkien, and I'm wondering, in that, but also in your research too, with the whole project, what really kind of stood out to you as far as overarching patterns that came out? Like what pulled you to, you know, well, what we say when we work with storytelling, like what worked upon you the more you teach this, the more you kind of continue to work on this project personally?
Mm. Um, well, and that's such a makes me think of Robert Ramanujan's The Wounded Researcher, which is a book about methodology and what he calls an alchemical hermeneutics. And he asks the question of, what what in the research changes you? Not just how do we shape the research, but how does the research shape us in this reciprocal way? And the thing that I found throughout the process, I think I one point naively thought, well, I'm just going to document these parallels between the two red books, and that's it. That's enough. Just lay it out, and um, it's a nice demonstration of a beautiful synchronicity. And then I came to recognize through the intense process of writing a dissertation that I had to have some kind of theory that held this together, that there needed to be a thesis behind the parallels. And really, what that led me into were these questions around the nature of the imagination. And that it's such an affirmation that the imagination itself is real. And I really needed to get into understanding what the faculty of the imagination is as a human faculty and capacity, how that related to the imaginal realm as articulated by everyone from James Hillman to Henri Corbin. Well, what's the relationship between this realm and our faculty of imagination? And I realized that a lot of these terms get very blurry. And usually we're set up in our particular contemporary culture that can be so disenchanted. We're set up with these dichotomies. You have reality, and then you have imagination. You have fantasy, and then you have the real. And as I began to look more at fantasy and vision and even dream, that everything that's landing on this side with the imagination could no longer be kept separate from reality. And they all ended up on the side of the line. Indeed, there was no line. The line started really to blur. And the great takeaway for me was that the imagination is a source of wisdom, a very valid way of knowing. It's something that brings us to true insight about the world, about the psyche, about the interconnection between the world and psyche, indeed, that they are not separate, like modernity so often likes to pretend, but that they're deeply interwoven. So, if anything, all of this led to a reclamation of imagination as a real and valid way of knowing. And that can be extraordinarily empowering because when we are raised in a culture that disparages the imagination, that and notice how people use the terms. They tend to downgrade it with words like just or only, merely. That was just a dream. It was only your imagination. Why do we do that? Why do we put those words there? And it's because imagination is something that's dangerous. It can be perilous. And so we have to learn how to wield that power. And it's much easier to suppress that power than to teach people how to wield it. Because if people know how to wield the imagination, then they can bring forward a better world. They can change the world. They can dream and fantasize the world into being where there is justice, where there is such thing as truth with a capital T, where we do care for one another with love and harmony. And that's not put down as just a fantasy. It's much easier to control people within a capitalist system, for example, where people have to bargain their labor, their life force, to be able to survive within a system. If your imagination is alive and well, and everyone's is, it's much harder to fit into that system and just be a working cog day after day after day until this elusive moment of retirement.
Mhm.
So, being able to affirm the power of the imagination is very dangerous because it can completely overturn the world order. Um, you have one or two people where it's sparking and they get to kind of create their bubbles within that. And that's an extraordinary privilege. But what if everybody has that capacity? Then we really can see something change.
Absolutely. And, as you're speaking, I'm thinking, as a Jungian or post-Jungian, really what that means for the individual as well. When we're working in a way that we use the imagination for this creative pursuit, or this divine creation that makes deep change. The imagination is really that kind of intermediary aspect that bridges the brain, uh, if we want to get technical, but creates that bridge to the unconscious, and is the redeemer of our images that get thrown in the unconscious. And very much that image of redemption coming up in what you were just saying, that if we're able to tap into that, we let ourselves do that, we can individuate personally and collectively, and make these big changes, and that the imagination is required to imagine a way forward, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so, well, it was great to have you, and I think, listeners have a wealth of knowledge now, and I encourage them to run out and get this book, and also read The Lord of the Rings alongside it. I was reading it, and I was like, wow, I really need to go get a copy, like you
Mhm.
say in the book, and read it alongside, because now I'm into all this stuff I'm into and what I do for work. Like rereading it, I'm sure would be a total ride, and I think I'm gonna do that this summer.
Oh, beautiful. That'll be a wonderful journey for you to be able to take. And I have a feeling that knowing your knowledge of Jung and his red book and the black books and all of that, that you'll probably be able to see a lot of, well, the parallels I saw, but you'll probably be able to find a whole bunch of others too that only your eyes can reveal. And that's what I always want to encourage individuals to do is whether it's reading Jung's red book alongside some other story or novel or great work that you appreciate, or reading the Lord of the Rings alongside something, there really is something to be said about that intertextual dialogue that then points to that image making faculty, the imagination that stands behind all of them as
Oh,
they
yeah.
come forward. Yeah.
You reminded me of Spider, and I was like, yeah, Spider is a big part of my dissertation too, and all her ways that she shows up. So I'm sure she's in The Lord of the Rings. So I better go amplify that and take a deep look. So thank you so much for joining me again. You're just an amazing speaker and an amazing wealth of knowledge when it comes to archetypal things and Tolkien and the imagination. So I think people need to hear about it more, and even people who are Jungian therapists who seem to not put the imagination first, but it is at the forefront of this type of work. So thank you very much.
Thank you too. It's such a pleasure getting to speak with you, and I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank
Me
you.
too.